My name's on like the governor's list or the VP list or the future whatever list. And it's cool to be on those lists, but that doesn't matter. What matters is the timing. In politics, timing's everything. So you could be uber talented, but if you get the timing wrong, it doesn't work out.
Washington is full of people who can talk the talk, but that don't walk the walk. Lots of members of Congress, we hear them making speeches, very active on social media. And when you actually dig a little deeper, you want to scratch at the surface and see what they're actually doing. You realize they're not really doing much at all. And I'm not going to call out names today, but it's true on both sides of the aisle. And these days, in the new media age, where people are really just trying to work for clicks on social media, there's more and more of that. And just sort of people are just there to disrupt, to be disruptors, which there's a good way to be a disruptor, and we're seeing the president do that now. But when you're talking about members of Congress and the legislature, they've got to get work done. Our guest today, Byron Donalds, is actually the exact opposite of that. In his short time in Congress, he's filed over 100 bills, and not on nonsense, but on really serious issues related to finance, related to energy, and many other issues. We're going to go through them today. Byron Donalds comes from Southwest Florida. He served in the Florida House of Representatives for 4 years. He comes from a finance background. It's a really different background than what we usually see in politics. And hopefully, as you listen to the podcast today, you'll see immediately that he really has a different level of understanding of what he's trying to accomplish. He has the substance, but he also has the oratory skills. He can speak very well and explain really difficult things in a really simple way that can deliver a message. He's also had a huge impact if we looked at the last Congress with leadership and the leadership dispute. People on the far right, let's call them in the Freedom Caucus, we'll listen to him, whatever he says. He knows how to lead, but he also knows how to bring people along the ride with him. There's a lot of buzz around Byron Donalds about his potential run for governor of the state of Florida. President Trump has even mentioned it. We're going to talk about that with him. We're going to dive in today to some topics that I think are very interesting and that he's very passionate about. First is nuclear energy and what we can do to increase nuclear energy in the United States to become energy dominant here in America. And then we're going to talk about fiscal conservatism. It's an issue that he's brought with him from the State House in Tallahassee to Washington. Everybody's on the DOGE train. I feel like he's been on that train for a long time. I think everyone's going to really enjoy this discussion. We're here in Washington, D.C., and we're super excited to welcome Congressman Byron Donalds. This is Standpoint, and I'm Gabe Groisman. Byron Donalds, thanks so much for joining me.
Man, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me on, Gabe. I'm glad we were able to make this work.
Yeah, for sure. Listen, we've been trying to get this to happen for a while. I see you everywhere. I came to DC for something else, but this was supposed to be live in person. You're now home for all the right reasons in Florida. So I'm glad we can do this anyways. And why don't we just start right there, Byron? I mean, you're really a family man. Something that really, the first thing that jumped out at me when we met a few years ago, a husband, father of 3 boys, very involved in your church and your community. Tell me a little bit about what that means to you, what role your family plays in your life.
It's actually everything. I didn't grow up with my dad. And so growing up, it was me and my mom and, my dad and my mom, things didn't work out between them. And so, I had my older sister is 10 years older than me. My younger sister's 10 years younger than me. So I have siblings, but in some respects kind of, grew up kind of like an only child to some degree. And, my mom really struggled to try to do everything that she could on my behalf. And so growing up, the thing I always wanted to make sure I did was to be a father to my sons, to my kids. Didn't know I was going to have all sons. I think God knew best that I didn't need a daughter, and that's all well and good. Respect to all the dads with the little girls out there. But
God said the opposite thing to me because he blessed me with 5 daughters and no sons. So,
oh wow. Wow. Yes, I mean, look, I think, I wanted to be a dad. I really did. I wanted to provide that insight, that leadership, that tutelage to my kids. That's something that was really important to me in my 20s into my 30s. And so, when I moved to Naples and Erica and I got married, kids happened fast. And so now my sons are a little older now. My oldest is 21, the middle one's 17. Both of them graduate high school and college respectively this year. They're both graduating. And then my youngest is 13 and he's in the 7th grade. And, watching them now all either in teenage years or young adulthood, and watching that matriculation from when they were infants and toddlers has been really cool. I think the thing that with, parenthood, especially fatherhood, is you can see a portion of yourself in each one of your kids, but then they're their own unique being. But there's a piece of yourself in them, and to try to find that balance between, you know, holding them accountable and discipline, etc., but then nurturing and love and mentorship and leadership. It's an interesting balance you got to try to figure out, every day or every year. But I love it, man. I'm really proud of my sons. They are all really maturing, um, some faster than others, but that's just the way it is. But they're really maturing in a really positive way, and it's cool. I got a senior graduating college, and to from I remember when he was born and crying when he was born to now he's about to graduate college and go off into the world and be his own man. It's really a blessing. But that was always important to me. I'm glad that in the phase of life that I'm in that it was able to occur. And man, I just no regrets on that. Love my sons, love my wife. We've been blessed really as a family. To everybody kind of grew up together. Like my wife and I married young. We met really young. We just celebrated our 25th Valentine's Day. Our first Valentine's Day was in college. So, we've grown up together. We've watched our kids grow. It's really been a blessing. It's really been something special that you just can't replicate it. You can't buy it. You,
Yeah.
you just have to go through that process.
Well, it's incredible. So I got married young as well, just so you know. It's funny. I've been doing this podcast for a year and change, never spoken about this, but I also got married. I was 23 years old. We've been married 21 years with 5 kids. And what's incredible to me is whenever I like look at someone who I respect and admire for what they're doing in whatever field that they're in, almost all the time they have a strong family life at home. The best thing you can do, I'm sure you can agree, for your kids is to have a strong relationship also with your wife so they can see what a good loving relationship is like, and then build a relationship with each of those kids. And the hard part though is, and I wonder to get your thoughts on this before we dive into some policy stuff, but is as a public figure, so many times public figures want to hide their family life because you want to have some personal time. And just because you're
Yeah.
in the spotlight, it doesn't mean your kids agreed to be in the spotlight to do anything, right? So you are rightly, and everybody really tries to be protective of their family, or most. But in this country, we're dealing with such a lack of leadership when it comes to family and family values and building a strong nuclear family. And all we see out on social media and even in mainstream media, it's just about personal advancement, but without talking about what's happening at home and that necessary building block. So, what do you think you or we, or just sort of as a society, we can do better to try to promote the family lives that we all try to live and lead, to be able to show the younger generation the benefits of that?
Um, I think the first thing is it does start at home. I mean, like people will assume that you have a family that's strong, it's a strong unit, that things are perfect. It's never perfect. It's
Of
worse.
course.
It is, people are people, and then things happen, and it's really about commitment. I think that's the biggest thing. Like you love your family, you love your children, you love your wife, but it's about commitment. I joked with Erica one day. It's like sometimes, like I love you, but sometimes I don't like you, and that's just the way it is. But I think it's demonstrating that commitment to each other and really to your kids, regardless of what's going on that particular day. I think on a broader level, especially if you're going to do something substantial with your life, having your family as being that foundation is critical, because the world is full of ups and downs, distractions, etc. But knowing that you can go home, and home is a sanctuary, it's kind of like it's a haven, and you can go home and really be able to be yourself, relax, engage in topics and relationships that have nothing to do with what you're doing business wise. And some of it seeps in, it comes home. It comes home with everybody. But to be able to have that foundation is really, really important. I think if people just see your relationship with your wife and see your relationship with your kids, I think that helps younger people want to make the right decision, which is to get married and have kids and really build that family. I remember I was talking with a bunch of seventh graders and eighth graders at a YMCA in my district. And I was telling them, I'm like, look, if you want to have the pathway to being successful, get married. have kids as being married. Like that's the pathway. These other ways don't work. And like, don't believe Instagram, don't believe at the time Facebook, I guess you could say Snapchat now or some of the other stuff, but like, don't believe that stuff because they're just showing you what they choose to show you. But when you have a family and a close knit unit behind you, it gives you so much ability to do other things in life that are really impactful. So I just think you just model it. I don't think you can be afraid of it or try to hide it too much. But you do want to protect it, and everybody wants to protect their family because you want it to just be a place where you can get away, frankly, from the world and everybody else to recharge your batteries, get refreshed, and go about there and conquer the next day.
Yeah, amazing. So let's dive in. I think the first time we met, where when you started with Congress, the first words out of your mouth there were something to the effect of, "We got to get nuclear back on track." And I was surprised that you were focused on nuclear energy, and you've been so focused on it, and I'm trying to bring nuclear back on track in the United States. And really, it's a talk of the town now on the business side of government. Let's say folks are talking about small nuclear modular reactors, SMRs, and how that can help with the data center business and try to create the energy infrastructure that we need internally. There's grid issues all over our country. So even if we're generating enough energy, getting it out to people, to their homes and to their businesses is a huge problem all over our country. But nuclear is something you've really focused on. Last summer, you had the big nuclear push, I think you called it, with 6 pieces of legislation on nuclear.
Yeah.
The Advance Act passed, bipartisan act passed last year, and I think in the fall of 2024. No one really paid attention to it outside of Washington, I think. But tell me a little bit about nuclear and why you're so focused on that and what problems you think it could solve for.
Well, I mean, first of all, how I got into like nuclear policy was really because of, my committee of jurisdiction. We were studying ESG policy, and I was on small business committee at the time, and ESG was like this thing that the left and the Democrats are pushing. It was all the rage of how they were going to reform corporate governance and all this other nonsense. And when you started to dig into ESG policy, what you saw was is that they were putting downward pressure on banks and non-bank institutions about lending or providing as capital to what they've called non-green energy. So like natural gas, oil, coal, but nuclear fell into that bucket. And I was like, well, why is nuclear in this bucket? And I started reading about it. And what you realize is that um, for the entire life cycle, beginning to end, the cleanest form of energy we have is nuclear power. Like it's really not even close. And then when you look at the ability for it to be a consistent, reliable base load power, um, which is what our country desperately needs, then you start just using common sense and being like, listen, I'm not a fan of solar and wind, but let's just be honest. Those are what we call peaking powers, meaning when the sun is out, yeah, you can get energy generation out of solar, but when the sun's down, guess what? There's no energy generation. So that's not a consistent power source that you can count in your base load. Wind, if the wind is blowing, okay, cool, you have some power. But if the wind's not blowing, guess what? You got nothing. So that's like a peak power. That's something that comes and goes, but it's not consistent. The most consistent form of energy is nuclear. I was at the control center at Florida Power and Light and looked at all our different energy mixes. And you could see it on just their boards. Like sun would ebb and flow depending on the time of day, and wind would ebb and flow depending on the weather. Coal was pretty consistent. Nat gas would have minor fluctuations, but nuclear was just one straight line across the board, nonstop. No matter what you did, it was there. When you look at the desires that our country needs from, you mentioned data centers, obviously, with cryptocurrency and digital assets and blockchain technology, which I think is the future of our economy. I think that's just going to continue to grow. You look at the desires we have for air conditioning in Florida, but really in so many parts of the country, heating homes. Everybody wants to, not everybody, some people want electric cars. Well, how are you going to charge them? All those different aspects of our economy, you need a strong baseload power. And then we have many demands for petroleum products, like our demand for petroleum products, not just gasoline, not just oil, but the derivatives of petroleum, hair dyes, plastic water bottles, computer screens, contact lenses. Honestly, Gabe, the suits that we're wearing have derivatives of petroleum in it. The demands for petroleum products, which is in everything in our houses, everything that we see, that only continues to increase year over year over year. And one thing people don't really know is that we've not built a new oil refinery in the United States in 40 years. So our demands for petroleum products continue to rise, but we're entering a bottleneck because there's only but so many avenues to refine that petroleum. So if you're looking at just energy for commercial use or for residential use, you say to yourself, well, what will help us meet the demands we have while we can still meet the petroleum demands we have and not take away from the products that we buy? Well, nuclear. And so that's how I got there. And so it really was just looking at it from a common sense perspective. We need nuclear power. We've had the technology. Frankly, we created the technology. And we got away from it in part because I think the environmentalists, in part because of fears of nuclear meltdowns like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. Fukushima came a lot later. And when you go and read about what happened at 3 Mile Island, what you realize is that yes, the plant melted down, but the plant melted down as it was supposed to. The core was actually contained. So the technology did work. In Chernobyl, the Russians or the Soviets at the time were using nuclear technology that nobody uses today. Like they were actually misusing technology, ignoring the caution signals. And so that's what happened with the Chernobyl plant. But the French power most of their country, the vast majority of their power is nuclear. And they were actually reinvesting in nuclear again, because why would they want to get power, natural gas from the Russians? They'd rather just power their country with nuclear power and have themselves be self-sustainable. And so that's how I got there. And I think now that people are, and it's bipartisan, it's not a partisan thing. I think members on Capitol Hill, Republicans and Democrats are coming to the realization that if you want to love solar panels, love them. If you want to love wind turbines, love them. But we need baseload power. We need large amounts of it. And you can't even get to grid modernization if you don't have the necessary power flow that is consistent over time. I think where small modulars and micro reactors come into play is because the technology is so advanced now, we don't have to build the massive Turkey Point reactors. We don't have to build those massive. They kind of look like chemistry beakers. We don't need to build those anymore. We can build them if we need to, but we don't. We can actually build the small or micro reactors, the same stuff that's been on our nuclear subs for 80 years. We can build those, and then you can actually create a more efficient grid in the future where you're laying those reactors as you need them to meet the power demands of people and of commerce.
The most interesting part of that when we're talking about reactors is the cost. The cost of building them is astronomically high. So people in that industry are looking towards government to see if they'll subsidize or give out loans or whatever it is to try to help make it happen, because the money they got to outlay to actually build one of those, whether it's in especially the SMRs and the high technology ones, which still they're being built all over the world, but as far as I know, they're not implemented yet anywhere. I think Argentina was the first country to go forward with it. I was speaking to random conversation, but I was speaking to a nuclear scientist in Argentina. It's a family friend. And he was developing that in Argentina, and they're looking to bring that to the US. But when it comes to just energy in general, we're talking about oil and gas. That people in the energy trading market will talk about what the problem is. If we produce too much, the prices are going to go down. We don't want to produce more. We want to keep the prices high. So there's sort of that tension, and we can transition into a little bit about fiscal responsibility now. It's something you've been focusing on for a long time before DOGE was even a thing. It really was a conversation you've been having since your time in the Florida legislature, but also in Washington. When you look at, just to tie it together with this, when you look at investments that need to be made in energy and in infrastructure for our country, are those the kind of expenditures that you think government should be making, or is that also something that should be just laid upon the private sector?
I think it depends. I think in terms of the move towards nuclear being more a part of our energy mix going forward, I think it is an appropriate. I'll use the word investment. I don't like using that word from the government's perspective, but I'll use it here. I think it is an acceptable use of funds. And the reason why that is because what you're essentially doing is you're laying the foundation to supply a consistent flow of energy costs into the economy. If you can master or control your energy costs over time, then you actually have the building blocks to build a more stable, a more efficient economy, and one where you can start to measure consistent growth over time, which will help us model, the government's fiscal obligations and find a way to pay those down. So I'm a big believer in that nuclear can be a stabilizing force in prices. I get the guys in the commodities future market who are looking at the price going forward and they want to keep it at a certain level. But from the federal government's perspective, we can't have a specific interest in the price of certain energy commodities. We have to make sure that we are providing the general marketplace with the ability to set a energy mix that keeps prices affordable for people and for corporations. And so that energy in and of itself doesn't dominate the expense line item in people's homes or in businesses operations. And I think that's the key thing we want to get to. So in short, yeah, do I think you could do loans or guarantees or maybe even credits, which quite frankly we do now in a lot of aspects in energy? Yes, we can. I think the key thing is we should only be doing that for things that are sustainable, and secondarily, I would say we should only do those for things that we can actually manufacture and manage here in the United States. We are getting, no matter how anybody feels about solar panels, the raw materials for solar and wind come from the Chinese. They're dominating the globe on that stuff. So I'm not interested in an energy grid where I have to pay my rivals in order to get it. I'm not interested in that. With nuclear, we have the technology here in the United States. We actually have the raw materials if we begin anew of mining for the various elements that you need. We can mine for uranium in New Mexico and in Arizona. We can do that. And then you have some newer technology that uses thorium that doesn't use uranium. And so there's different ways we can do this. I would rather have that be self-contained in the United States. So then that way you have business operations who are leveraging each other to create an energy platform for the United States. And then whatever we do with natural gas, oil, etc., that's great stuff we can do. We can use it obviously here. We can export it as need be. And that's all to the benefit of the United States.
Yeah, really. And if anyone takes an honest look at those kind of policies, it's good for America for economically. It's good geopolitically because if not, we have to buy energy from the world's worst actors. It's good environmentally, which is a part that I think the surf riders just filed the lawsuit against the federal government for approving drilling offshore, which is ridiculous. Because if we don't do it, it's going to be done somewhere else where there are absolutely no safeguards, environmental safeguards at all. We can do it cleaner and better
Right.
here in our country while supporting our own economy. Anyone looks at what DOGE is doing as well, a lot of people are killing or attacking the messenger, Elon Musk, but the message is really hard to attack because uh, they're doing incredible work, just bringing down, getting rid of waste, and who wouldn't want to get rid of waste? But this morning I was thinking, when the DoD is coming out with across the board cuts, and when there's programs in places like the DoD, like it's CDMRP, Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, which has been historically out of DoD. Programs that are important just for tons of different people that affect their lives. Are you concerned about across the board cuts as opposed to sort of going in with a fine tooth comb and finding the waste, which is what we've seen the first couple weeks, just
Right.
finding these disgusting programs that everybody's outraged about, and it costs a lot of money. So we save a lot of money. We get rid of the DEI, ESG, and we're saving money. That's one strategy. That other strategy of just sort of cutting across the board does worry me some. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not as concerned about cutting across the board. And then the reason why that is because our deficits are $2 trillion. 1.8 trillion is our deficit now. It's slated to be 2 trillion next fiscal year. And so the way I look at it, and this is just from my background being in my finance background, is we can scream now about cuts or we can squeal later. And that's very blunt, but it's just the truth. If we don't get a handle on the fiscal future of the nation, the cuts that will have to be done in the future will be far more painful than anything that gets done today. We have a runway to do this. We can do it efficiently. And I think When you say across the board, yeah, every agency would take a haircut, but it will be essentially using a scalpel to carve that stuff out. We are still spending 35 to 40% more um, on the discretionary side of the federal budget than we were 6 years ago before COVID. And the only reason that the budgets got juiced was because of COVID. So myself and a lot of my colleagues in the House were saying, just go back to pre-pandemic spending levels, and it'll actually help the situation where you don't have to go in and make some of these tougher cuts. But the reason why this is not occurring is because Washington is just averse to cutting anything. The town is really built to continue to grow and spend money, not to retrench and tighten its belts. And so the process of getting the town to tighten its belt is a painful one for Washington. For most people, they're just looking at it and saying, oh, what's Elon doing? Does he have access to the payment system? But what nobody will tell you is that Joe Biden gave access to the same payment system to 53 students. Like he gave access to people who were not even full federal employees. The same access. Was it a problem then? I was on my local radio show before we were doing this, and I said they're concerned about an unelected billionaire, but the Democrats have no problem with unelected bureaucrats. Like, which B is better, a bureaucrat or a billionaire? At least I want a smart guy in there looking at it and going through everything and saying, this is wasteful, this is good, this is not, and let's find a way to do business and keep the thing going. So I think across the board, I'm not overly concerned with. I think right now there is going to be some fine tuning about how they do it. If I had my druthers, yeah, I would send federal spending back to pre-pandemic levels. And it would be a shock, but then we would all figure out how to operate and move on and continue to live and do business because people generally are very, very resilient. But if we continue the way we're spending money now and we don't pull it back, then there's going to be real pain later. Social Security and Medicare go insolvent in 8 years. When they go insolvent, according to federal law, there are automatic benefit cuts of 22% in each programs. I would prefer not to do that. The reasonable thing is to make your adjustments today. In Medicaid, the largest population on Medicaid right now are able-bodied adults without children. When Medicaid was created, the purpose of Medicaid was for adults with children, adults who have disabilities, and then of course children. That was the purpose of Medicaid. When Barack Obama expanded Medicaid 10 years ago, they opened up the door to able-bodied adults without kids. And listen, I get the cost of insurance and I get the cost of living. I do understand that. I'm not trying to be insensitive to that. But we cannot have whole systems where you have adults between the ages of 18 and 55 on these programs. There's a GAO report about the Medicaid population that half of the able-bodied population on Medicaid, and I mean, these are adults, no children, are not working. So, like, what are we doing? Like, we have people on a program who are not working, but they're getting a federal benefit. And then the Democrats would say, oh, you can't take people's benefits away. I think the American people, by and large, have no problem helping people who need help. Like, I'm a kid from Brooklyn, New York, Gabe. My mom, she was on Section 8 and she was on food stamps when I was in middle school because she lost her job and she was trying to find a way to get back on her feet. And yeah, we use those benefits to get back on our feet. But these benefits can't be a lifestyle. And if they continue to be a lifestyle, what ends up happening is everybody's going to have to take a major cut. And then nobody's going to like it. And then the most unfortunate thing, which I can foresee happening in Washington, is that because the major cuts would be forced, there will be politicians in Washington for their own personal benefits would say, we're not going to do that. We're going to waive the rules in these programs. And that's how our country goes from 36 trillion in debt to 60 trillion in debt overnight. And last thing I'll say about this, I feel very strongly about this, and I'm trying to make sure I'm laying this out responsibly. Interest on the national debt is now the number 2 expenditure of all federal spending. Number 1 is Social Security. Number 2 is interest on the debt. Number 3 is Medicare. Number 4 is defense. Okay. If we don't get this under control, interest will be the number one item that we spend money on. And that's how you get into a debt cycle. And you don't have to be a finance guy to realize that once you get into this situation where the number one thing you spend money on is interest to continue borrowing money to spend the things you want to spend money on, you cannot survive that. The nation won't survive it. So I rather take the necessary pain now and reorient these systems than not do it, kick the can down the road again. And yes, there are going to be major cuts on the horizon because insolvency is coming. That's what the math says. I'm not trying to be a political prognosticator. The math is the math. And right now, in the federal budget, the math ain't mathin'.
So I'm sure you're glad to see the conversation shift because as a
Yeah.
Republican who believes in Republican sort of policy points, at least most of them, one of the big ones is being fiscally conservative, and the party really veered away from that for a long time, right? The Republicans would talk the talk, but wouldn't walk the walk on that at all. It was true in the first term of President Trump, where everything was growing. You can blame it on COVID, et cetera. There's lots of things. But now to change the culture in Washington, like you spoke about, on saying, okay, let's tighten our belts. Things don't look good. By the way, I did that with my family in December, like most families at the end of the year, where we're spending too much. Let's see what we can do. Let's spend less on this. On the personal side, you look for subscriptions, that hidden Netflix subscription that you didn't know you had.
Yeah.
In the federal
Yeah.
government, the numbers are a little bigger, but it's the same process. We were going to talk about foreign policy, but I'm going to put that aside for the next time you come on the podcast. We'll do a whole foreign policy show. But I do want to talk about Florida. You are a Florida guy. There's been a lot of drama in the state Florida politics scene in the last couple weeks. There was a special session called, two special sessions called, first by the governor, well, both by the governor, but first because the governor was trying to push an immigration bill. It didn't work out. He went head to head with the legislature. Then they came back, made a deal, came back and passed it. What's your take on what's going on in Tallahassee?
They were always going to make a deal. Look, I think the legislature coming in, new speaker, new Senate president, I think they were trying to assert themselves. I think Governor DeSantis, you know, he's the governor. And so the governor, I don't care what the dynamics are, is going to get the lion's share of what he wants. And so they just had a temporary conflict. And, you move on. I think why it was kind of jarring is because the previous versions of the Florida legislature largely let or gave Governor DeSantis purview on what was happening legislatively. And I think this version of the legislature wanted to have more of a dialogue with the governor, got a little messy, got out on social media. But at the end of the day, they were going to cut a deal and land the plane and move on. And I'm glad that they did that. And, now they're back to business. I think, it's funny. I joked with some of the guys that are still serving Tallahassee, and I said to them, "So, are you guys trying to take on the posture of the U.S. Congress in Tallahassee and how things can be at the congressional level?" But legislative bodies are, at the end of the day, they're about personalities, they're about personal dynamics, they're about policy, and yes, they're about ideologies, and all four of those things um, matter equally. And sometimes the personalities take on an oversized part of the process. And I think the real test of being able to work in a legislature is how do you deal with the personalities and the psychologies of your colleagues? And how do you assess it? How do you work with them? What are their pressure points? And it's a constant assessment that's always being done if you're going to be effective, while also, moving policy and making sure the right thing is happening. So, I mean, look, they had their fight, they got through it. The governor largely got his way, which is what was going to end up happening anyway. I think the thing that I was most concerned about with that whole process was how they were gonna do the chief immigration officer, my concern, I think I said this before publicly, was police powers reside with the governor. So, like, anything you do where the governor doesn't have those policing powers is just not it's just not going to work. It's not going to be appropriate. It's not going to work. You can't give it off to another member of the cabinet wholly for their own situation. I just didn't agree with that piece, but I knew they were going to get a deal done, and I'm glad that they did.
Yeah, that move seemed like like a poison pill. Like they knew it wasn't going to happen. It was a way to negotiate something.
Yeah.
Well, I thought the interesting dynamic there, which you didn't mention, but I'm sure you thought of, is both sides of that dispute kept talking about their discussions with the president. So the governor was saying, "Well, I spoke to President Trump, and he said," and then Danny Perez and Joe Gruder say, "Well, we spoke to Trump, and he said." It was sort of they were each fighting, saying, "Look, we have a direct line." But Florida is turning really interesting because it's for many people become a ruby red state. It's hard to see how a Democrat can win statewide there. But the flip side is that people in our party don't like to admit is that Kamala Harris was a terrible candidate. She was the worst candidate that the Democrats, I think, could have put forward, or one of the worst ones. There's a few others that can compete for that. So I think the Republican side is getting a little complacent when we look at the numbers, whether it's in Florida or somewhere else, but focusing on Florida, saying, look, we won Miami-Dade County by 12 points. We won almost every county in the state. It's a red tsunami, a red hurricane, whatever we want to call it, bigger than a red wave. But the question is if that's gonna hold moving forward when we have different candidates not just on the Florida ballot, but on the top of the ticket. What are your thoughts on Florida? Does a Democrat have a chance of winning statewide in Florida in this next election?
I never want to say never, but I don't think they have much of a chance in the next elections and coming up in 26. I think to a broader level, you have a situation now in Florida where now we're the best state in the country, period, full stop. You have to give full credit, the lion's share of the credit to Governor DeSantis and his job. But I always make sure you acknowledge Governor Scott and even Governor Bush, because to get a state to where it is right now, it takes consistent leadership over time. And I think for people who are new to Florida, Florida used to be a blue state, and then it was a purple state for a very long time, and now
Right.
it's the leading Republican state in the country. And so now the real challenge for us is you're the best state now. Now how do you stay the best? Pat Riley wrote a book. I think it was after the Lakers repeated in the 80s. I think it was after they repeated as champs. And in his book, talking about the process of it all, he talked about the disease of more. And it's like when you're on top, then everybody wants more stuff because now you're the champs. And I think for Florida, what we have to kind of look at, like I'm a sports guy. I'm a basketball junkie. I love pro basketball. I love college basketball. But as a sports guy, I think where Florida is, we are kind of where the Bulls were after '92. Like not only did we win, we won again. And so now we're looking at the future saying it's our show. We essentially run the league, or we're the best state in the country. Now, how do you stay consistent? That's going to be the real challenge, and it's just doing the little things. It's making sure that you're staying on top of government programs, that they're not losing focus and losing sight of their mission. It's stopping mission creep. It's making sure that the policy agenda remains focused on the interests of citizens and the liberties of the people of Florida, continuing to be the free state of Florida, and that's a day in day out like work habit. It becomes less about speeches and more about the day-to-day nuts and bolts of what you're going to do to keep the state going. So I think we're in a great spot. If I had any concern is that, you know, what we don't want to be is California. California used to be the golden state. It used to be the red state. And then for whatever the reasons were, and I think it'd be interesting to read the history of California from Governor Reagan to where it is today. But it's easy to lose focus when you're on top. And I think that now the pressure's really on to kind of get out of some of the petty Republican infighting stuff and be focused on making sure that Florida maintains its standard as the best run state in the country. And as long as we
Yeah.
could keep that focus, we'll be good.
Yeah, and it's even more than that. I think when you're up top and you have a full control of the legislature and you're winning, right? To use your analogy, sometimes you want to keep pushing forward on the agenda, but you don't want to outrun your own state. And I think if you look at California, that's what happened on their side, or it's happening now, where they became more liberal than the people in California were, right? If you look at the
Yeah.
legislature in California, it's not a reflection of the people, most people in California. It's like the worst of the worst. It's almost like what some parts of social media are, right? Or is. So that's really I think a problem. Lots of rumors with you, Byron. Are you going to be in Congress forever?
No, And it has nothing to do with what goes on in the future. I told my
Come on,
district, you're going to get
that
10
was a
years
good
out of me.
intro question to asking you if you're
I
running for
know.
governor. Come on, that was good.
Yeah. Nice try. Uh, no, I mean, look, in politics, you're not supposed to stay forever. I'm in my third term in Congress. The most I would ever do is 2 more terms, and then I would move on. We'll see what happens. I know the governor's race is coming. It's a hot topic. I've seen the polling. I know what's out there. Um, Man, right now, you got to do your job in Washington. We got to get the president's agenda through. We do that, then I think then there's something you could talk about. Until that gets done, there's really nothing to talk about because, I spent a lot of time on the trail for President Trump and for colleagues in the House and colleagues who are in the Senate now, and some who didn't get across the line that I tried to help get across the line. And so we have a golden opportunity. I don't care what size the majority is. We have a golden opportunity to really put in the foundation to move this country uh, into a great position to be great again and do wonderful things. And man, I'm focused on that. Let's get that done. We'll figure everything else out after that.
All right, so my last question is about timing, right? Because this is really about timing. When,
Yeah.
not for you in particular, right? But the race is in that election is in less than 2 years. What would be the right time for folks to start getting into that race in a serious way?
I mean that's tough, and I think it really does depend on where are you in that process. I think that if you're starting from zero, your time might be like yesterday.
Right.
If you're starting from a really good spot, you could kind of hang out for a while for several months and figure out, I might announce here or there. You can wait to the end of the year. Who really knows? I think it's different for every person. Uh, Running statewide is a different animal than it is running for Congress or even running, for a state house seat. When I ran for my state house seat back in 2016, I needed the full 18 months. So I announced early and I needed that entire time. Actually, shoot, I announced in March of 2015. So actually
Wow.
coming up on that anniversary pretty soon. I announced in March of 2015 because I was known by certain groups in my community, but I wasn't known throughout the entire House district. And I needed the time to get on the ground and meet everybody and to raise enough money to be effective. And I needed that time. So I think that's kind of the way you answer it. It's all about what that candidate needs to be successful, and you can't really gauge that because everybody's on their own timeline. One thing I will tell you though, and you mentioned timing. I did a podcast the other day, and they asked me about like my name's on like the governor's list or the VP list or the future whatever list, and my response to it is it's cool to be on those lists, but like that doesn't matter. What matters is the timing. Like in
Yes.
politics, timing's everything. So you could be uber talented, but if you get the timing wrong, it doesn't work out. And so you just want to my position, me personally, and I know I'm moving around the main topic, but that's fine. To me, you have to have the timing right. And if the timing is right, then everything else works out. Um, and that's really it. I joke with my staff all the time, like, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. And so me personally, I try to stay ready for whatever comes, but the timing is critical in any of these decisions. You get the timing right, you can do a lot of things.
Yeah, it's definitely all about timing, and so there's some of that's in your control, and some of it's not because there's other folks in the race.
Oh
But I
yeah.
do want I
Oh,
do
yeah.
want to announce to you, I know you're worried about it, that I'm not running for governor in 2 years. So if you're worried about certain folks, you don't have to worry about me. Also, the early polls are nonsensical. No matter which way they look, there's one was good for you, one was not good for you. They're so early. It's more about name recognition when you're looking at a poll 2 years out for a governor's race. So
Yeah.
a lot of it gives people in the media something to talk about. It gives me something to ask you about. But there's a reason I didn't pull up the polls because I don't put much into them at all. But Congressman Byron Donalds, thank you so much. Thanks so much for your time. I know we went over a little bit of the time we had allotted. I appreciate it. Thanks for all you're doing, and we'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks, Gabe. It was a pleasure to be on. We're gonna do this again. We're gonna do it live.
We're gonna
I'm
do it
gonna make
live.
sure we'll do it live.
We'll do it live and we'll stream it. So make sure there's no editing. We can get you to say things that you want to take back, but it's already been out there. No, I'm kidding.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Everyone else, please make sure to like, subscribe, follow, do all the great things you do to support podcasts, and we'll see you next week.